Buenos días a todos. Primero que todo, me gustaría agradecer a los organizadores de esta conferencia por invitarme a dar esta charla ante ustedes el día de hoy. Considero esta invitación un gran honor. Sin embargo, debo comenzar pidiéndoles disculpas por dos cosas. En primer lugar, lamento no poder estar con ustedes en persona. Desafortunadamente, mantengo demasiados compromisos acá en la Universidad de Glasgow que me impiden acompañarlos presencialmente. En segundo lugar, lamento también no poder continuar mi presentación en español. Quizás si es que hay una nueva oportunidad y con un poco más de práctica por mi parte, podré hacerlo mejor. So now I have to continue in English. I have titled my talk today, Reforming Juvenile Justice, Supporting Desistance in Chile. And I'm going to begin in an unusual way perhaps for an academic by qualifying or cautioning you about the limitations of my expertise in relation to reforming juvenile justice in your country. First of all, I'm not a juvenile justice specialist. As a criminologist, most of my work is concerned with adults in the criminal justice system, although as you will see as I go on to discuss the research, there are many links, clear links between the development of juvenile delinquency and the process of subsequent desistance from crime. So I'm confident that the research has much to say to questions of juvenile justice. Secondly, I have very limited knowledge of the Chilean context, both political and economic and cultural. I don't know enough about your country to be confident about making clear prescriptions about how your system should be ordered and organised, and I know very little about how your institutions and practices of juvenile justice are currently constituted. So I'm in a poor place to give you advice on how to reform them. Thirdly, although I think a lot about the process of desistance from crime, how people stop offending and why, I don't know anything about desistance in Chile specifically. I'm not aware of any studies of desistance in Chile, and your crime problems and the ways in which young people move away from offending in Chile may be somewhat different from the patterns of desistance in other jurisdictions, and I'll come back to that point later. Fourth, I'm not a practitioner anymore, nor am I a policymaker, and as a researcher, as an academic researcher, I think I have a lot of knowledge to bring to a discussion about juvenile justice reform, but I'm not sure that even if I did know your country well and your system well, and even if I knew how desistance takes place in a Chilean context, the business of providing practical prescriptions for change in juvenile justice depends on a dialogue between different forms of expertise, academic, professional, policy-based expertise, and, as I'll argue at the end, the expertise of those people who have themselves travelled the road away from crime or gone through the desistance process. My final point, I'm not confident about the process of policy transfer in criminal justice. When innovations in criminal justice are developed in one jurisdiction, often the energies and enthusiasm of the people who develop new approaches leads them to believe that they have a remedy for problems which are global, and therefore they often have a desire to take their new method or their new tool or their new approach to other places. But for all the reasons I've just given, if the cultural context and the institutional context and the crime problems and the desistance pathways are different in that country, then it's not so clear to me that policies and practices can transfer straightforwardly. So my offering today to you is really just the beginning of what I hope is a dialogue between my understanding of desistance research and your experience and expertise in the Chilean context, and hopefully together that creates the possibility of something useful emerging. What I can do then is share my experience, and I do have experience of juvenile justice practice in Scotland, and policy engagement around questions of juvenile justice in a number of jurisdictions. I can certainly share research findings about desistance from quite a large number of jurisdictions now, although mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. I can pose questions for you and provoke debate about different approaches to juvenile justice reform, and I think I can suggest some broad directions for policy and practice development, but the detail depends on the conversation with your own knowledge and experience. So first of all, I want to begin with the question of evidence-based practice. All of us, I think, practitioners, policymakers, academics, we want to develop approaches to tackling social problems which are rooted in robust evidence. We want to be confident that the policies we develop and the practices that we implement are going to have positive effects. But deciding what kind of effects we want depends on being clear about the purposes of our juvenile justice system. And in fact, juvenile justice systems, I think, anywhere in the world tend to have complex and sometimes conflicting purposes. So for example, if I pose the question, what is your juvenile justice system for? What do you want it to be for? You might answer, it's centrally about promoting the welfare of vulnerable children who are also sometimes troublesome. Or you might say, it's about protecting children's rights. First and foremost, it's about protecting the rights of children who may be marginalised and excluded, criminalised and penalised. Or you might say, it's about reducing offending by young people, because that creates problems for communities, problems for cities, problems of policing, problems of criminal justice response. So we want to reduce reoffending. Or you may say, we want a juvenile justice system which punishes young offenders. And all four responses exist in different jurisdictions around the world, and more commonly they are blended in ways which sometimes cause conflict between the purposes. And the question of evidence then depends on an articulation of what kind of ends we are pursuing. I can't tell you what works to punish. I can't tell you directly what works in terms of promoting children's rights. I can't tell you what works in terms of promoting the welfare of vulnerable children. I can tell you something about what I think helps young people to move away from offending. But that may only be one purpose of your system, and you need to bear that in mind in listening to my remarks. One more encouraging comment I could make at this stage is that when I look at the evidence about how and why people manage to leave offending behind, my reading of that evidence is that in fact, a lot of the process of desistance is about the process of securing integration in society, about moving towards participation and inclusion. So it's not really so very far from questions of welfare, and it's not so very far from questions of rights after all. Now, as I get into the question of how we frame juvenile justice and how desistance research can help us in that process, I want to start with a proposition. And then with a qualification of that proposition. So first of all, it's my belief increasingly that we should judge criminal justice and juvenile justice interventions not so much by the evils or harms that they reduce, so not so much about reducing risk or reducing reoffending, but more we should judge them by the human and social goods that they promote. And to explain the difference, I sometimes use the metaphor of plumbing. So we all live in houses and we all recognise the importance of plumbing, and we also know the consequences that flow from leaks in our plumbing systems. So if you have an unattended leak in a plumbing system, very quickly the fabric of your property can be damaged, and if the leak is left completely unaddressed over the course of time, your property may be destroyed by the leak. And so when we think about plumbers, what we are thinking about is getting somebody to fix a leak, to reduce the risk that a leak will destroy the fabric of our home. But there are other people that think about plumbing differently, and they are architects. So when architects are designing a house, they're thinking about plumbing not as a leak-producing problem, but rather as a mechanism that brings water and warmth to the places where we need it in order to make life in that place or in that habitation desirable and pleasant. And I think we should think of justice and justice interventions more as part of the architecture of a good society rather than as a way of fixing problems or leaks in the good society. However, like most criminologists, I am instinctively a minimalist when it comes to criminal and youth justice interventions. The evidence suggests that if we intervene too much, too early, and in ways which penalise and label people, then we are more likely to frustrate or impede desistance than we are to promote it. There's a very famous study in my country, the Edinburgh study of youth transitions, which shows that even in a juvenile justice system which is based on a welfare principle about the best interests of the child, merely becoming known to that system at a young age, other things being equal, predicts slower desistance rather than swifter desistance. So despite the fact that our social workers are trying to promote approaches which are about enhancing the child's best interests, the fact that they become known as children in trouble, children who offend, creates a labelling effect which leads them to being reprocessed by the formal authorities in ways which are counterproductive to the desistance process. So when we intervene in juvenile justice, we have to be very careful about reserving mandated, formalised interventions for those who really need those interventions, for fear that intervening too much, too soon, and in the wrong ways will cause the problem to become worse rather than better. Another way of thinking about the same sort of issue is to consider two ways in which a penal system or a justice system can respond to offending. In many systems, particularly adult systems, responses to offending are principally retributive or punitive. And we can see these in one way as systems or responses which aim to slice off the offender from the community. Those systems are preoccupied with negative exercises of penal power. They impose harms on people. In some jurisdictions, for some offences, they take away life. In most jurisdictions, those kinds of sanctions take away liberty. They often take away time from people, including in community sentences, or they demand effort from people. And they also take away worth from people, social status. They impose shame, and they can also remove money and financial resources through fining systems. These are all ways of taking something from the offender in order to punish them. But equally, in most systems, there are also positive exercises of penal power. And rather than slicing off, we can think of these as ways of grafting in the offender to the community, grafting them back in. And those forms of sanctioning require goods from offenders. They aim often to somehow enhance the capacity of the person to live a good life and to make a social contribution. So they aim to develop liberty, the positive exercise of liberty. They elicit constructive uses of time and constructive effort from people. They aim ultimately to enhance their worth, to rehabilitate their status in society, and even sometimes to compensate them for the losses that often lie behind their offending. We know that young people in trouble are most often among the most socially disadvantaged, marginalised people in the community, those who are on the hard end of inequality. And that creates a duty, I believe, a duty for the state to respond in ways which ameliorate or reduce those disadvantages. That's part of rehabilitation. So if we move then to desistance, desistance essentially is a process of moving from participation in behaviours and patterns of life which are damaging to other people and to oneself into behaviour and a sense of self and a participation in community which is more adaptive, more positive, more constructive. So it's a process of personal and human development, but that's also a process which takes place in and is always shaped by its social and cultural contexts. So as well as being a behavioural transition for the individual, it's also a social transition from one social position to another. This involves movement away from offending behaviour, but it also involves movement towards successful social integration, citizenship and participation. Putting this a different way, scholars talk about primary desistance, secondary desistance, and now sometimes tertiary desistance. So that the simplest way of understanding desistance is, in the primary sense, it's the absence of offending behaviour. But often the mere absence of offending behaviour tells us very little about whether a person's changing and whether their social position is changing. I may cease to offend because I have a broken leg and I'm not fit to offend. But that absence of offending behaviour shouldn't reassure you that I have changed or that my position in society has changed in a positive way. So scholars then have become more interested in secondary desistance, which is about the way people see themselves, the extent to which they internalise a different sort of identity, a different sort of label, and manage to leave the label of offender behind them. And linked to this progression in identity is the development of a sense of belonging in community, participation in community. And when the person has secured an identity change linked to behaviour change, and when that's accepted by the audience of the community, then we have a secure basis for desistance. In terms of explaining desistance, the next diagram summarises 4 broad approaches to understanding how and why desistance occurs, and I'll be very brief in going through these. The first is linked to processes of ageing and maturation. And here the explanation is simply that offending is overwhelmingly an activity of young people, and that there's something to do with becoming older and becoming more mature, which enables us to think more rationally, to appraise situations differently, to consider alternative behaviours, to pause and become less impulsive. And so ageing and the development of psychological maturation is implicated, according to these theorists, in desistance processes. But a second explanation looks not so much at ageing or maturation themselves, but rather about the social contexts of maturational processes. So as we age, we also move into education, or we move into employment, and we move into intimate relationships, and sometimes we become parents. And these social ties and social bonds alter our behaviours, influence our behaviours in a number of ways. They give us new opportunities, perhaps, to live in a more legitimate way, but they also give us certain incentives and motivations to change our conduct. And they fill our time differently. These activities and social ties fill our time differently. However, a third group of scholars argue, well, not everybody who gets older, not everybody who gets an education, not everybody who gets a job, not everybody who finds a partner, not everybody who has children stops offending. So there must be more to the explanation. And they look to these questions of identity that I've been discussing already. So what is happening that is enabling a person to come to see themselves differently, to re-story their life, to learn a different narrative and to enact a different narrative? That's bigger than just getting older, and it's bigger than your social ties. Crucially, it depends on what those ties mean to you. So it's about the subjective aspects of desistance processes. And a fourth group of scholars more recently have placed particular emphasis on situational aspects of desistance. So here the focus is not so much on what's going on in the person and not so much what's going on in their social world. It's more the geography of their life. Where are they spending their time? What does that do to what criminologists call opportunity structures for offending? Meaning simply, are they in places and with people that are close to or likely to be readily tempted into participation in criminal activities, or are they withdrawing physically from those networks, those places, those situations, and restructuring their routine activities in such a way as to enable them to continue to live legitimately? So these 4 aspects are important. All 4 of them are important, and most contemporary theorists of desistance argue that these 4 forms of explanation interact. So it's not a case of choosing between them. All of them have relevance. Now, the key question perhaps for you in the context of this conference is, how can criminal or juvenile justice impede or support these processes? And if you just think for a moment about these 4 theoretical approaches to desistance, it becomes obvious how certain forms of sanctioning might not create a very conducive environment for desistance from crime. So let's think about detention facilities, whether for juveniles or for adults. A lot of research tends to suggest that psychological development in total institutions, in detention facilities, is slow at best. And some scholars even argue that prisons represent a kind of deep freeze for human development. Some go further and argue that prisons are sites of adversity and trauma that actually negatively affect human development. The central point here is that prisons and detention facilities in and of themselves are not places where people typically take responsibility. Decisions are made for them, life is done to them because of the nature of these institutions, and so it's not easy to see these places as places of maturation. Secondly, those sorts of places are also not places where positive social ties and positive social relationships are nurtured. Going into a facility might have the effect of breaking ties to an offending or delinquent peer group, but it might also damage positive family ties, and by its very nature, it will place you in close association with other people involved in offending. Thirdly, detention facilities are not the ideal place in which to construct a positive narrative or a positive identity for oneself. In a prison, one is a prisoner. And even in a juvenile detention facility where one might hope that the ethos would be different, the young person still knows that they are there because they are an offender. And so trying to think of ways in which an institutional environment can be adapted so that it doesn't reinforce negative identities is important, but also deeply challenging. And equally, the situational aspects of life in institutions may mitigate against desistance, partly because the person is not themselves constructing choices to move around and be in places that are safer and better. Those choices are governed by the institution. And the routine activities of the prison or the detention institution might in fact in certain respects be delinquent in themselves or criminogenic in their effects. So it's simple to see on one level that detention is a difficult place to nurture desistance, and yet that's not to say that we can't have better or worse detention facilities, better or worse prisons with regimes which are more adaptive, more suited to trying to encourage desistance. I wanted to very quickly take you through this model from Bottoms and Shapland, which explains something about the desistance process. And this is relevant to juvenile justice because it concerns a study of a relatively large number of young men, principally in the northeast of England, in the city of Sheffield, who were very persistent offenders, so heavily involved in offending. And Bottoms and Shapland, in a very carefully constructed study, examined their trajectories away from crime in the early 20s. So not so far in age from the juvenile justice category. And what they discovered, if you follow the diagram here, is that we have a person who at step one in this process is currently involved in offending. And then they're exposed to some kind of trigger event which encourages them to reconsider their conduct, reconsider perhaps in more broad terms their lifestyle. That trigger event might be bereavement or loss or injury, or it might be a new opportunity that comes in the form of a new relationship or employment, a new residence. There are a number of possible triggers. The trigger provokes, at step two, a wish to try to change. So the person is formulating a desire to change. And then the next step at step three is the beginning of a process of thinking differently about oneself and about one's surroundings, one's social world. But notice that on this diagram, the arrow at the top from left to right shows movement away from offending. And steps 1, 2, and 3 don't travel very far to the right. So it's not that the person yet is taking active steps to desist, it's that they are deliberating about that process. Then step 4 involves action. So we move to the right on the bottom of the diagram. The person takes action, but immediately they face difficulties. Typically they face difficulties. And those difficulties might come in the form of obstacles to change, practical obstacles, the lack of an income, the expectations of old delinquent associates, the lack of hope that they might have, the lack of hope that others might have for them, the reputation that they have in a given community, the fact that people expect only trouble from them. So there are a number of different obstacles that might cause a difficulty for the person in taking active steps towards desistance. Maybe the person fails then at that point. They fail to overcome the obstacle and they go back round the circle, through relapse and into offending again. But sometimes the person will overcome the obstacle or get round it in some way, and at step 6 in this diagram they attempt maintenance. They try to maintain the change. And if a person maintains a change repeatedly, that's reinforcing. That helps them to develop self-efficacy, a sense of belief that they can change, that they can sustain change. And they may also find reinforcement from people around them. That might be friends, family members, partners, but it could also be a juvenile justice worker who is consciously, actively reinforcing the positive steps that a young person is taking. And with enough reinforcement, and with some of the obstacles overcome, the person in this diagram exits top right with a crime-free identity as a non-offender. But notice also there are 2 wheels in the middle, 2 circles in the middle of this diagram. The top one is labelled pre-programmed potential. And what the researchers mean here is the sum total of the person's developmental history and what that means for the human capacities and attributes that they have, the skills, the knowledge, the abilities that they have. And given what we know about young people who are drawn into juvenile justice systems, many times that potential has been restricted by adverse developmental experiences and by systems contact. So the person may not have tremendously strong personal resources to get them through this difficult journey. And secondly, the second wheel is about their social resources. So the social capital that they possess, the networks, the relationships, the connections. And obviously, if we're talking about desistance from crime, they need a set of connections and networks that are with people who live legitimately, who have what researchers call licit social capital, rather than the illicit social capital of the criminal gang. So acquiring or developing one's potential as an individual and developing one's social capital is critically important in resourcing a person for this journey. I wanted to just give you a little bit of more qualitative research which I think elucidates that kind of process a little bit further, and this comes from Beth Weaver, who's a colleague and sometimes a co-author of mine. This is her PhD study, which is a brilliant analysis of the trajectory, the life trajectories of a group of 7 men who were an adolescent gang together, who offended together, violent offending and property offending. And she tracks them at the age of about 45 and interviews them to explore how their life trajectories have evolved since their time together in the adolescent gang. And she says here, the social relations, intimate relationships, family, friendship, faith and work groups, which were most causally influential in the desistance process, were characterised by solidarity and subsidiarity. In other words, a sense of we-ness, or I would say a sense of belonging. This is the tertiary desistance idea that I mentioned earlier. Put simply, subsidiarity is a way to support and help another person without making him or her passive or dependent. It allows and assists the other to do what they need to do for themselves to realise their ultimate concerns, goals or aspirations. Subsidiarity can't work without solidarity, and solidarity means sharing responsibility through reciprocity and by implication interdependence between people. These principles, solidarity and subsidiarity, confer mutual responsibilities on each person for supporting change and in taking responsibility for personal change. And what's intriguing about Beth's study is that almost all of the men, all but one of the men, desist from crime at different stages, and they don't desist by leaving the gang. The network of friendship relationships is continuous in their lives, but its force or potency, the way in which it directs their lives, changes as their relational concerns, the people and relationships that they care about change over the course of time. So what was once the delinquent gang becomes, in some respects, a desistance gang over the course of time. And that's without intervention from juvenile justice agencies. This is a natural process for them rather than a supported one. So when we take these kinds of understandings of desistance and begin to apply them to practice, as I said earlier, I was a criminal justice social worker with a mixed caseload of young people and adults in the 1990s. Taking these ideas and trying to apply them to practice means several things. So firstly, in the literature about this, we've talked about moving from offence-focused practice to desistance-focused practice. And the simplest way to put this is that instead of spending our time analysing patterns of offending behaviour and identifying what went wrong in the past, practice has to become more prospective, more forward-looking. So the task is to identify and plan a desistance pathway informed by this research evidence, but critically also informed by dialogue with the young person and by those in their social network. And in a paper published in 2006, I described the case for a desistance paradigm for offender management or for criminal justice social work. And this was a reframing device, the central notion in which is to put at the front of our thinking the process of change and not the mode of intervention. To explain, desistance happens. There is a natural process of desistance for most people. The movement away from offending can, I believe, be accelerated and supported by the way that we intervene, but we shouldn't regard desistance as something that practice or intervention produces. It's a subtle difference, but an important one. Interventions can support the process, accelerate it, or impede it and decelerate it, but they can't produce it in any straightforward or simple way. The process exists before, behind, and beyond the intervention. And so the task is to fit the intervention to the process, not to slot the person and their process into the intervention. So that's the central idea. The model goes on to explain the need to develop human capital, so that's the potential and capacities of the individual, and the social capital is the social resources, and to give people opportunities to make good on a troubled past by repairing social relations. And critical in my thinking here is the idea that juvenile justice interventions and criminal justice interventions are less about fixing broken people and more about repairing damaged social relationships. That's not to say that people don't need help developing their human capital, their personal resources, but it is to say that even developing your human resources will not fix a broken relationship. That requires more than one party. If you'd like to see more detail on a framework for a practice process which draws on these ideas, then the internet link at the bottom of slide 12 takes you to a paper called Towards Effective Practice in Offender Supervision, which was written for Scottish criminal justice social workers a few years ago. So there's more detail on the process and supporting the process in that document. But to give you a brief summary of the main implications of desistance research for practice, this slide summarises 6 key points. So first of all, this process of desistance is hard, it's difficult, it's challenging, it's characterised by lapses and relapses. There are many obstacles. People's motivation and commitment to change will waver typically. And I'm talking here about people who are in an established and entrenched pattern of behaviour. Obviously, if the offending is fleeting or occasional, that may be less difficult to shift. But if we're talking about persistent offending, then change is hard. And therefore, practice has to be realistic about the complexities of the challenge, and we need to think of ways to manage the lapses and the setbacks. Secondly, the approach that we take to supporting the process has to be individualised. If, as we saw from the theoretical context, the process of desistance is in important ways a subjective process where an individual has to apprehend opportunities for change as opportunities for change and has to reappraise themselves and their social world, then it's very difficult to standardize a response or an approach. And that's one of the reasons why I refuse to write a desistance program or even a desistance protocol, because we need reflective practitioners who are skilled enough to engage with the individual subjectivities of desistance. Part of that engagement has to be about building a sense of hope and a sense of agency or control over the direction of one's life. There's good evidence now from desistance studies that part of the desistance process is believing that change is possible and then exercising a measure of self-control over the change process, taking command of it. People involved in persistent offending tend to be very passive and fatalistic, almost regarding offending as something that happens to them. Desisters in research seem to somehow acquire the capacity to believe that they govern their own life, that they set the direction. The process of desistance is inherently relational, as I've explained, and therefore working with and through social relations and through the working relationship between the juvenile justice worker and the young person is absolutely critical. The fifth implication is that we have to be clear about how we're going to recognise and celebrate progress. Justice systems are very good at denouncing crime, at labelling and shaming offenders. They're not so good at having processes and rituals that celebrate change and positive transformation. And more generally, the kinds of language that we use and the kinds of representations of the people that we work with need to change in ways that support the reconstruction of their positive identities. And lastly, we need to look at the routines of people's lives. Where are they spending their time? Who are they spending their time with? What can we offer in the juvenile justice system that provides practical support in reconstructing different routines? And that's where you may connect with employment services. You may try to connect with a whole range of different community activities, sports, participation in the arts. There are a whole number of forms of civic participation that might help to displace routine activities which are criminogenic. If you want to know a bit more about practice responses to desistance, the journal on this slide, slide 14, Scottish Justice Matters, is available free online and has a special issue on desistance with a paper that I wrote with some colleagues based on a project that aimed to elaborate the practical models that could flow from desistance research, devised with ex-offenders, with their families, with practitioners and policymakers. So that's worth reading, and I think there's at least one paper in there which deals directly with juvenile justice. On the right, The Road from Crime is a film that I was involved in producing a few years ago, linked to the same project, which is a 45-minute documentary film about the process of desistance, which we used in workshops to stimulate ideas about practice development. And the film's available with Spanish subtitles, so that ought to be useful in your context. Okay, so I'm coming to a conclusion now, and what I wanted to do is just to return to the question of the purposes of juvenile justice. And here in this slide, in slide 15, I have a model of 4 forms of reintegration. And here I'm thinking about what somebody desists into. So not so much the process of desistance or the journey, but rather the destination. And the idea for this comes from the film, where the narrator of the film and the key character, Alan Weaver, who is himself a criminal justice social work manager, but also an ex-offender, an ex-prisoner, asks that very question: what are we asking people to desist into? And that's where the cultural and social context, the economics of Chile, mean I'm sure that that's as tough a question for you to answer as it is for me to answer in Scotland. But at least conceptually, I think we're asking people to desist into a more integrated position in the community and in the society, and there are 4 forms of integration. So desistance does involve a kind of personal process of change and a personal reintegration. So this human capital development, capacity building, releasing of a person's potential, the redevelopment of their self, the restoring of their life, the crafting of a new narrative, that's critically important to desistance. But I would argue most criminal justice practice, most attempts at rehabilitation historically have been preoccupied almost solely with that project or with that top left quadrant in this diagram. And my suggestion is that our systems need to move into the other three elements much more consciously in order to produce a more balanced approach to supporting desistance. So if we go down to the bottom left quadrant, we need to think about judicial reintegration. And in respect of judicial reintegration, the central challenge is of formal delabeling. I don't know what the Chilean system is for dealing with criminal convictions. Perhaps you have a more enlightened system than we do, but we have a problem that when ex-offenders are seeking employment, criminal records checks often lead to a de facto bar from a wide range of employment opportunities to which the offending may not be relevant. And perhaps in Chile that's not such an issue, but even if it's not, processes of certification of change, positive rituals which celebrate and recognise the progress of young people who are moved away from offending, I think is a critically important symbolic part of the desistance process, which is a bit like a citizenship ceremony for a new migrant coming into a country. It's them being welcomed back after having completed a process of change. That judicial process, however, won't be enough unless society and community is also prepared to accept back the reformed ex-offender. So social reintegration in the top right quadrant is about the extent to which we're able to work in and with communities to enable them to better support desistance. And this is linked to a wide literature in crime prevention, in community safety, in socio-spatial criminology, which shows that lower crime communities tend to have high levels of collective efficacy and strong reciprocal bonds and relationships within the community. So we need to find a way to help to build that efficacy to support reintegration. But, and this is a crucially important point and a difficult one, communities are unlikely to take people back if they feel that moral debts are not settled. And formal punishment through the juvenile justice system or through the adult system may or may not satisfy a community that a formal debt has been settled, that what the person owes the community or the victim has been paid. And so I think juvenile justice and criminal justice systems need to think about moral reintegration too. And here I'm thinking about restorative practices, mediation, if you like, between the parties to try to repair the broken social relationships that I mentioned earlier and to build social solidarity. So that kind of mediating, bringing together, restoring relationships aspect of desistance is critical. There is also another aspect of moral reintegration which I think is about the state's duty to the young people themselves. If we accept that those young people have suffered the consequences of the structural arrangements of a society, the limited opportunities that it provides, its incapacity to attend adequately to their welfare or to their rights as children, then there's a moral duty that flows in the opposite direction from the state and its agencies to the young person also. And I think I said when I made the proposition about judging justice by its positive outcomes that I set a challenge there, and maybe this last or penultimate slide gives a little bit of guidance on how to think about this further. If we think about integration and social solidarity as positive goods that a justice system can aim to promote, then we have to think about how we are going to measure the capacity of juvenile and adult justice systems to deliver integration or to support integration. And this model from Ager and Strang on slide 16 is a model of or a conceptual framework of the core domains of integration based on research with asylum seekers in the UK. So it may or may not be perfectly parallel with the integration issues for young people who've been involved in offending, but I think it's interesting that it starts with a foundation of human rights and citizenship, and it moves through facilitating factors around language and cultural knowledge and a sense of safety and stability, both of which are key to allowing the person to feel able to move into social relationships. And then the social connections above, the social bridges are about connections between communities and into relationships with people who may be different from oneself. The social bonds are about your tighter and closer social ties to your family and close friends. The social links are to do with your connections to social institutions and to people differently placed in the social hierarchy in terms of local politics, for example, or the delivery of local services. And then the markers and means of one's integration are about employment, housing, education and health. So there's no mention of crime here, but there is a lot of forms of positive social good, which I think might give us a very interesting different metric of judging whether or not practice is succeeding, and therefore a different way of constructing evidence-based practice. If these were the outcome measures, I wonder which interventions we would be calling evidence-based. So I want to conclude just with 2 or 3 points, 3 or 4 points, to sum up what I've said. The first thing is we can't even begin a conversation about evidence-based practice until we have clarity of purpose in juvenile justice. So normative issues, questions of principles and values, questions of law matter a great deal, and we need to keep those sharply in focus when we begin to think about how to construct institutions and practices. Secondly, I think we need a more expansive conception of what evidence-based practice means, both because we have to recognise the variety of purposes that juvenile justice serves, and because we need to get past a limiting preoccupation with evaluation as the only form of evidence that counts in evidence-based practice. Desistance research is not evaluation research. That's why I have no method to give you. It's a form of explanatory research that illustrates and explains and seeks to understand a process of human development in social context. I would argue it's a bit like teachers needing to know how children develop and learn before they ask questions about how best to teach them. That's not to say that I don't want my children to be taught by teachers who understand what works or who understand evaluation research about pedagogical approaches, but I definitely want my children's teachers to understand child development, because only then will they have the capacity to adapt their practice to suit the specific and unique needs of my children. So desistance research comes into the framework of evidence-based practice in a similar way. It's a knowledge base in which we embed the development of practice. It's not in and of itself a practice method. To get closer to a practice method, my suggestion is that we take a co-productive approach, meaning that we work with people who've travelled this journey of desistance from crime, with people who are currently involved in juvenile justice, your clients, the young people, their families, the frontline practitioners who understand the challenges that they face, the lawyers who understand the human rights questions, the policymakers, other institutions of civil society need to be involved in co-producing practice models based on the sharing of different forms of expertise. And crucially, to go back to my opening point about my own limitations, that constellation of people who could be involved in co-production in Chile, you'll understand your context better than I can, so you'll be better placed together to make judgments about how to bring this research to bear in your system. And lastly, I just want to leave you with a question. Is your purpose the integration of young people, the promotion of their welfare, respect for their human rights, and not just reducing their offending? I'm hoping that the answer is yes, otherwise much of what I have said may have passed you by. But if your purpose is integration, the development of social solidarity, enabling young people to move towards participation and inclusion, then make it your process and your measure too. Don't judge your interventions simply by whether or not they reduce offending. Judge them by whether or not they succeed in promoting integration. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't speak too quickly for the translators, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.